Hello, I'm Sam Mentzer with the Chattanooga Public Library. I serve as the recording instructor and studio manager downtown at the main branch on the second floor. I'd like to start talking about EQ, which is shorthand for equalization, and the ways that we can use EQ both creatively and constructively. But first, I need to talk a little bit about the frequency spectrum, which is what we're actually manipulating with an EQ. So, where we humans can hear sound both dynamically, and that's the amplitude of sound, which you could think of subjectively as volume or loudness. We also hear sounds in reference to pitch, which would be like low versus higher sounds. Um, and this is plotted on what's known as the frequency spectrum. When we're looking at a frequency spectrum, how do we determine what this actually means? Is it's all based on waveforms. And waveforms, the simplest waveform is in a sound wave, that is. When we speak, we're creating sound waves, but the simplest waveform is actually a sine wave. And without getting too theoretical, just know that it's the simplest form of wave and it just consists of a fundamental frequency. So I'm going to play a couple here so you can get the idea of what that sounds like, and also the difference between two different frequencies. So the first one here we have, this is a 200 hertz simple sine wave. Now let's play this one, which is an 800 hertz sine wave. So it's definitely higher in pitch. Hertz brings me to my next point. So hertz is how we measure the pitch of a sound, and you can tell 200, which much lower in pitch than 800 hertz. So how we come to determining what hertz represents is by the following: a waveform consists of peaks and troughs, and as you can see here, and each cycle, a cycle is measured by one peak and one trough. And that's how we determine a cycle of a waveform. Now, how many cycles occur per second is how we determine the frequency. So that first sine wave I played consisted of 200 cycles happening per second, where the second one consisted of 800 cycles happening per second. So 800 cycles per second equals 800 hertz. 200 cycles per second equals, you guessed it, 200 hertz. So now looking at a spectral analyzer here, which can be featured on many modern EQs. They weren't always created this way, but you can see that our frequency spectrum goes from 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz. And this is roughly the range of human hearing. Now, a cat can hear much higher frequencies than we can, and many animals can. But you'll notice in EQs that you use, it's going to be 20 to 20,000, or what is also known as 20K. So 20,000 is also known as 20K. So with that being said, we find EQs on many different pieces of hardware and in many different programs, such as streaming. Your TV, your car stereo, for instance, might have some settings like low or low, medium, high. You might see some on some different car stereos, or even bass and treble is probably more popular. And what you'd have to do to know exactly what range that these bands, this is called frequency band, it's basically a range from one frequency to the other to the next one higher, and those controls were just that. So say, just hypothetically, your bass on your car was from 80 hertz up into about 400 hertz, and you would adjust that to take out some frequencies or even to boost those frequencies in that band. And this is there is no hard fast rule for basically distributing which frequencies belong to treble and bass or the mids and things like that. It's just each manufacturer kind of creates their own. And you'll see this on guitar amplifiers a lot too. So when you're recording, keep in mind, you might have bass, mid, treble, and then presence, which would be even higher than the treble. You can use your ears, you can read the manual, and it should tell you exactly what bands that these individual controls represent. So, how can we use this? Before I get too deep into EQ, I like to talk about just the difference between creative and constructive EQing. So, and then the next episode, I'll highlight some different EQs that we use in the studio. So, constructive, let's start with constructive EQing. That can be used for many different things. A lot of times, it's used for to eliminate what's called masking. And what masking is covering of the same band of frequencies by two different sources. So a bass guitar and an electric guitar have frequencies where there's crossover when they're playing. And to add even more complications to this, we're not dealing with sine waves anymore when we're talking about bass guitars and electric guitars, because these instruments, like all instruments and the human voice and most sounds besides sine waves in the universe, are complex waveforms, which means that it's not just your fundamental frequency, but then there are actually overtones above that. So there's more waveforms combined, and you actually have a very complex waveform. And let me show you a difference here. I'll show you on a spectrograph, so you can see here. This would be a sine wave. Now take a look at this one here, and this is actually a complex waveform. So as you can see, a lot more information when it comes to complex waveforms. They take up a lot more sonic real estate in the frequency spectrum as well. So one way we can eliminate masking is by using some simple EQ to remove parts of different instruments where they are sort of taking up the same real estate as another instrument. That's one of the main ways that we can use constructive EQing. Now, creative EQing, there pretty much are no rules, but I'm sure you've heard effects like this before, where it sounds like I'm speaking through some sort of old telephone receiver or something like that. It's a very popular effect called the telephone effect, and it's produced by using EQ. I'm basically just taking a lot of high frequencies and low frequencies out of my voice and leaving just a very small band in the middle to make it sound like I'm coming out of some very small object like an old telephone receiver. And that's one creative way, but there are many others. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about those next time, because it's also a broad subject that you can find yourself talking about for long periods of time. And we'll look at some EQs that are based on famous EQs and different types of EQs, such as a graphic EQ versus a parametric EQ, and then how frequency analyzers have been implemented in many modern EQs these days. So I hope that you've learned a little bit, at least, about the background of the frequency spectrum and how we determine the measurement of frequencies. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you take care and join me next time. Bye.